And with that, a little bit about our presenter. Dr. Benjamin J. Crain has been working with orchids for more than 20 years. He completed his bachelor's degree at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, majoring in conservation biology and geography and minoring in environmental studies. He subsequently completed his master's degree in the Department of Biological Sciences at Humboldt State University, where his thesis concentrated on plant diversity and conservation in Napa County, California. He later completed his PhD at the University of Puerto Rico in San Juan, where his dissertation focused on ecology and conservation of Lopanthes orchids. Since earning his PhD, Dr. Crain has continued his research in plant ecology and conservation at the International Institute of Tropical Forestry, the University of Tennessee, and the Smithsonian Institute. He is currently a research associate with the North American Orchid Conservation Center and has worked in the Orchid Collections Department at the U.S. Botanic Garden for the past 2 years. We're delighted to have him with us today, taking your orchid care questions. So take it away, Benny.
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dr. Benjamin Crain. As you were just told, I work with the Orchid Collection, specifically here at U.S. Botanic Garden, the Collections Department, where I operate out of 6 different greenhouses that we maintain that are designated to our orchid collections. So I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. Let's begin.
Yeah, we'll jump on in. So we had a question in the chat. So this person says, my orchid is growing sideways instead of upright. Will the flower grow sideways too?
That's an interesting question. So a lot of orchids naturally will grow sideways. They are actually what's called sympodial, meaning it will grow kind of laterally from the main stem. If it happens to be one of those types of species, that's perfectly natural. What you want to do is generally train your orchid to kind of center it in its pot and allow it to grow across a pot. But as far as the flowering, again, that depends on the specific species. Some species, as you can see here, grow out of the top of the plant itself, whereas others, particularly some that will grow in that lateral sympodial style, can actually also flower out of the side of the plant. But again, in most cases, it's perfectly natural. Just check what species it is in particular and take a look for that. But generally speaking, it's perfectly natural habitat. There's nothing wrong with that. In a lot of cases, it means your orchid's growing quite well and it's quite happy.
Awesome, thanks. So what are the best pots for growing orchids?
That's a great question. And once again, there's no right answer for that. Here at U.S. Botanic Gardens, and in my own personal collection, I use a number of different kinds of pots. Generally speaking, one of the things orchids need is really good drainage. So regardless of the pot type you're using, what you want is something that will drain really freely. So when you water it, all the water should drop right out of the bottom. Or in cases like many pots, you can see here, they actually have openings in the side of the pot that allow for extra drainage. That can be really important.
Benny, did you say that was a specific type of pot? When you turned your head, I couldn't quite hear.
Oh, sorry. Generally, these types of pots, these orchid pots, will have openings in the side, and that allows for better drainage. And as I was saying, this is a terracotta pot, like many of you are familiar with. These are often very good for orchids because it allows air to pass through the pot itself. And going along with that, good drainage, good aeration is also really valuable for orchids. So a lot of our collection, we use terracotta pots for exactly those reasons. It will allow air to pass through, which is good for the orchid. It'll allow water to drain, and it can actually hold a little bit of moisture in the terracotta itself, which keeps humidity around the roots, which the orchids love. Now, alternatively, orchids generally don't really like to dry out. And so if you're in an area where keeping your orchid moist and hydrated is a problem, plastic pots can be useful for that, as they'll contain more moisture. They'll hold more moisture in. The plant will dry out slower. The downside of that is if you keep your orchid too wet, it can actually rot the roots out. It also restricts the airflow a little bit more, which can be detrimental to an orchid. So you kind of want to reach that happy medium, and that, again, your pot choice should be dependent on the situation you're growing in. So if you're in a really hot, dry environment, a plastic type of pot or a terracotta pot with a plastic cover, like a water collecting tray, can help hold some of that moisture in. But if you're in a nice, humid, kind of medium temperature environment, terracotta is fantastic. One other thing to consider is your growing conditions in terms of general cleanliness. So one thing is that terracotta can absorb a lot of things better than plastic can. So if you're dealing with things like fungal infestations or other pests, plastic can help kind of keep that stuff out. It's easier to sterilize and sanitize than terracotta might be. So again, consider your growing conditions, consider the specimen you're growing. If it's something that's really humidity loving and moisture loving, you might want to go plastic. Otherwise, I usually use terracotta. Plus, I think these look a lot nicer.
Very true. Very, very true. So speaking of sort of potting up your orchids, we had a couple questions about best medium to use. So like, what kind of medium should be used? And is it better to have them in bark or a more dirt-like medium?
Great question. So yeah, bark versus dirt. We're getting ahead of ourselves. So first of all, some orchids are terrestrial and they can grow in a soil type substrate. It should still generally be pretty well draining because even most terrestrial orchids don't want to stay extremely wet. That being said, the vast majority of orchids, particularly those you'd see in a flower store or in a garden center, those are epiphytic orchids, meaning they grow on trees. For that reason, the general media that we use and would recommend is fir bark and orchid bark. We have some examples of that here. It just looks like bark wood chips. But again, what that does is it allows the pot to retain some of the moisture in the bark, but it also allows that spacing between the bark chips to allow the roots to get aerated, which really helps them grow. There are a number of other additives you can add into that, such as granulated charcoal. We also use coarse gravel, which again, it holds air, but also allows moisture to pass through it freely. So it's all free draining stuff. So usually some combination of fir bark, orchid bark, mixed with some of those other additives. Again, for some really water-loving plants, some of these miniature pleurothalids like this Petunia here, these grow actually, again, right on tree bark. And so we mount them directly onto cork bark with a little bit of moss to hold that moisture in. So yeah, it depends on your species, but generally some kind of fir bark is the basis for most plants we grow.
Fantastic. We have a couple questions about roots and orchid roots. So one of them is, I have some brown, dried up, shriveled roots, but the ones down in the pot are green and healthy. Should I cut the brown ones off?
Yeah, that's a great question. And certainly you can cut those off, and most likely you should. Usually we do this when we're repotting orchids. So when you take the orchid out of its pot, as you mentioned, you're seeing nice green, healthy roots inside the pot. The brown, dried ones that are outside, we would clip off and remove those. Part of the reason is it can help stimulate new root growth, but also, as with any dead plant tissue, it can either be a result of some kind of fungal infection or bacterial infection, things of that nature. So eliminating it from the plant is really going to promote overall plant health. But also, they can also harbor things like pests and other insects. So there are certain pests that might not thrive on healthy living tissue where the plant can defend itself, but on these dead things, pests can thrive. And so again, you're eliminating potential future problems for that.
And another sort of related question with roots, do you have any tips or resources for reviving a living but damaged orchid? It's lost its leaves entirely, but the roots still seem to be alive.
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, it's often species specific as whether or not these things can come back. But if you have a healthy root system, a lot of plants can be revived. One of the first things I always recommend is repotting. If you have a plant that's just doing poorly, one of the easiest things you can do is take it out of its pot, look at the medium it's in. A lot of times it will be degraded. Degraded medium for orchids means it's going to hold a lot more water. It's going to have a lot less airspace. So you're basically drowning and starving and suffocating your root system. If that's the case, you can clip those dead roots off. If there's some healthy roots that are still there, new medium, in my experience, really generates a great response. Now, not every orchid can be salvaged, but that's certainly where I would start. Over the long term, I would consider what you had been doing beforehand. If your orchid is losing all its leaves and it's gotten to that point, it's likely not being grown in conditions that it would like. So consider changing it to a different window if it's in your house, a different part of the greenhouse, or a different greenhouse if you're growing it in those types of. But just like almost anything else out there, if you give it a new, healthy, happy home, it should respond accordingly if it can.
Great. So speaking of new, happy, healthy homes, when you transplant an orchid, how much bigger should the new pot be from the last pot?
That's a great question. Everybody's asking these species-specific things. So again, look at the species you're dealing with. Certain plants like dendrobiums or cymbidiums, cymbidiums like to be very, very tight in their pot. So generally speaking, you don't really want to increase the pot size much at all, if anything. And if you can get it back into a very tight-fitting pot, that's ideal for those types of things. A lot of dendrobiums just really don't like to be repotted. They like to be kind of tight and pot bound. So again, those types of things, I would keep the pot size, at least the increase in pot size to a minimum. That said, something like cattleyas and their relatives and hybrids, they have that sympodial growth where they're moving sideways across the pot as they grow. In that case, you don't want to be disturbing them every year. So sometimes they can start growing and they'll actually start growing out of the pot. So to prevent that, you can upsize your pot, plant your orchid on one side with the new growth aiming towards the middle of the pot. And then over the course of 2 or 3 years, it will kind of walk across the pot, if you will, and you'll have given it enough space to continue to grow new shoots in those new parts of your new pot. And so in those cases, you generally want to plan for, a year, 2 year, 3 years worth of growth. And so you can increase the pot size quite a bit in those cases. But keep in mind, every time you give it a bigger pot, the next time you're going to need more space, or you're going to have to cut the plant back, which a lot of people aren't really happy doing. And that is another option. If your plant does get really big and cumbersome, we have a lot of plants that will grow over the side of the pot and they start to get wobbly and they tip over. You can actually cut the plant back, the old part of the plant, as long as you have 3 or more, as a general rule, new growths emerging on one side. You can cut the rest back and replant that new portion of the plant and kind of maintain it at the same size over time, if space is something that you're having to consider.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So I do have a specific question for you. So this person has a Path Braden Nicholson cross with a Path Green Tea. It has mottled leaves and grew one large green flower, but it has not bloomed again in 2 years. Is there a tip for getting this to rebloom?
Yeah, that's a good question. It could be any number of things. You basically want to consider a few things. Are you watering properly? So has the plant been dehydrated? That will certainly slow overall growth and decrease your chances of flowering just because the plant might be. Another thing is changes, if you will. So a lot of plants like to have a drier season and a wetter season. So consider cutting back watering a little bit in the winter months if you're in a place that's relatively cool, for example. The same thing with light. Light changes can stimulate blooming or lack of blooming. So if you don't have enough light throughout the growing season, you might not get that bloom trigger later on when it would normally bloom. So consider changing your light conditions. And then, of course, fertilizing. if you haven't been fertilizing your plant rather regularly, without those nutrients, that can cause the plant to grow vegetatively, but it just doesn't have the necessary nutrients or energy to put out a flower. So try some of those things, and that should help induce bloom.
Awesome. We've actually had lots of questions about reblooming, and you might have already addressed this with your previous answer, but this person has a Cattleya orchid. They've not been able to get it to bloom. Do you have any suggestions? Their Phalaenopsis orchid reblooms most years, but they've had no luck with the Cattleya.
Yeah, so if you're considering Cattleyas versus Phalaenopsis, those are two fairly different plant genera that grow under different conditions. So Phalaenopsis, we tend to keep rather moist. We tend to keep them in rather low light conditions. Um, that is pretty much the opposite of what you want for Cattleyas. Cattleyas tend to enjoy much brighter light. So, for example, if you're growing it in maybe a north-facing window, that might not be enough light to get a Cattleya to bloom. They also like to dry out a little bit between waterings. They tend to have kind of less water in the winter, and they'll dry out a little bit more. And then when you get into the spring season, when they start to grow again quite actively, you can increase water and increase fertilizer, and that can be the trigger that will cause them to bloom.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks. I think since we're talking a little bit about watering, we've had some watering questions. Now would be a perfect time to ask our first poll question. So you'll see this pop up here. It says, I should water my orchids with ice cubes. And you want to say yes or no. It's true or false? I'm getting a strong response, it looks like, in one way there. So it looks like most people say false, but a couple people say true. So Benny, what is the correct answer there?
Yeah, the correct answer is you should not water with ice cubes unless you're growing orchids in Antarctica, maybe. They're not going to do well with ice cubes. And there's a couple reasons for that. And it's understandable that people have kind of bought into this myth, because I myself have been to the store or the local nursery and seen orchids with instructions that say just add an ice cube. So it's out there, but that is not correct. And there's a number of reasons. The first of which, so if you imagine an ice cube just melting, it's going to drip in one part of the pot, and it's not really going to provide moisture to much of your plant. One spot will be wet, the rest will be dry. So you're really not getting effective water to roots throughout the pot, and that will be problematic. Those roots will die, and your plant will suffer. The other thing is you're dropping ice water onto an orchid, and as I said, unless you're growing some of the random Alaskan orchids or something of that nature, that ice water is going to really harm the majority of plants we grow, like these Cattleyas that are in places like Brazil or Colombia or Ecuador, where they want nice, hot, humid weather. So you're basically going to be freezing the top of some roots and desiccating the rest of your roots, and so your plant isn't really going to respond well to that. I think that's an old myth for people who can't remember to water, and so they just dump a few ice cubes on the tray and forget about it. But, it's not the best for the plant by any means. What I would recommend if you're watering at home, we just use simple spray bottles for the most part. It's just a water spray bottle. You mist the plant on the bark media. You want to water the media that the plant is sitting in, not necessarily the plant itself. In other words, you don't want to be spraying leaves. That's another myth that's out there. A lot of people suggest spraying the whole plant. It's not going to harm the plant necessarily, but it can basically create ideal conditions in those leaf axils and the little crevices in the plant for things like fungus and bacteria and other insects to thrive. So you want to avoid that. If you're also using water that's tap water, it'll have a lot of mineral content in there. And so if you spray your leaves, you'll get all those white water droplets like you might see in your shower on your plant. It's not going to harm it necessarily, but from an aesthetic standpoint, it's not going to look the best. So we avoid the ice cubes, and we usually use spray bottles in our house. Another trick, which may or may not be useful, is a lot of times I recommend, if people have relatively good water in their sinks, you can actually put your orchid in the sink and just let water slowly run through the pot, spin it around a few times, and just soak it. When we water, the best way to do it is really to soak the plant as much as possible and then let all that water drain out. And then you can put it back where it's supposed to be growing. And that way you're ensured that you've gotten all of the roots and all of the media really saturated with water. And the reason that's important is it will stay humid. It will hold some of that water in those air spaces and allow those nice humid conditions inside the pot that the orchid will slowly make use of. What you don't want to do is flood an orchid and keep it wet. So some people have a lot of trays, water holding trays underneath their pots, and that's fine to prevent stuff running out, but you don't really want to fill up those trays. There's an old saying, orchids hate wet feet. So you don't want standing water underneath your orchid pot. So water it thoroughly and let all that water drain out. Leave it sit in your sink for 10 minutes or 20 minutes, and then put it back in the tray and put it where it's growing on a windowsill. And that will work a lot better. It also helps reduce your overall watering effort, because if you water it thoroughly, that humidity will stay in there longer versus just spraying it a little bit. You'll get the top wet, but the bottom might still be very dry, and that top surface will also evaporate a lot faster. So your plant will dry out overall a lot faster, and so you'll find yourself having to spray it more regularly. So if you're someone who doesn't have a lot of time to commit to checking on their plants every single day, water thoroughly and check on it every few days. If you've only got 5 minutes, use a spray bottle and just spray it 15, 20, 25 times and check it every day to make sure that it's still got some moisture in it.
Yeah, that was going to kind of be this follow-up question. We did have somebody ask, how often should you water your orchids?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there is no answer to that, of course, as well. It depends on your species and it depends on your conditions. So if you're someplace that's very cool, you may have to water less. Sometimes once a week is sufficient. Again, if you're growing something like these miniature pleurophalids that are just mounted on bare bark, these are going to dry out almost invariably every single day. So you'll need to water this every single day. If you have some drier plants, like some of the cattleyas, for example, you can generally get away with something like once a week if you water them thoroughly. You want to ensure that they dry out a bit, but you don't want them to completely desiccate. So wait till there's a little moisture, water it the next day. Now, that being said, it also varies seasonally. So if you're in a place that has distinct seasons like we do here in Washington, D.C., we'll water almost every day in some cases during the summer. During the winter, more like once a week. So it varies obviously with temperature, the amount of sunlight you're getting, the overall day length. Things will dry out faster, and so you're going to want to water a lot more in the summer. But if you have really good drainage, you can water, on average about every 2 to 3 days for your standard orchid, and it should do okay.
What about humidity levels? So we had a question about if you could recommend a way to create a humid environment for orchids in sort of a drier home environment.
Yeah, that's pretty much the biggest battle out there. Again, it depends on where you live. If you're down in Florida or Puerto Rico, the humidity is going to be there, but of course the temperatures associated with it are also going to be up, so they're going to need more humidity. In the house, if you're looking to humidify your air, I use a simple humidifier just to help things. Most orchids will want upwards of 50, 60, 75, 85% humidity. Some of the miniature cloud forest orchids, 90% humidity is perfect. So for those types of plants, some people will actually grow them in a terrarium. They'll have basically a glass fish tank with some humidifiers in there, and it seals everything in for the most part so that it's got constant high humidity. If you can't do that, other things you can do besides having your own humidifier are, as I mentioned, you can have those water trays underneath your pots. Now, what you don't want, as I said, is them standing in water. So what a lot of people will do is put some kind of gravel or clay pellets in those water trays, those water catching trays. Then you can set your orchid on top of those pellets and fill the bottom with water up to the edge of the pellet. So basically, your plant is sitting on gravel that's flooded with water underneath. and that will start to evaporate over time and increase some humidity around your plant directly. But humidity is a really hard thing to keep up, especially in a home growing setting. Another thing, as I mentioned, I also recommend they make some of those water trays that are much taller than the ones that just sit underneath. And so you can actually put your plant, if it's in a terracotta pot, in one of those when you water, and that'll hold a little bit of the humidity that's coming out as you watered in the pot itself, and that can extend the humidity a little bit there. But yeah, certainly humidity is a big challenge in the home growing environment. So regular, consistent watering is your best bet for keeping humidity.
Thanks. We're getting a lot of questions in the chat about fertilizing. So what should you look for in a good orchid fertilizer?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a lot of fertilizers out there. There is no one fertilizer that I would recommend. It depends on the plants you're growing, your situation. Some plants respond to other things differently than another plant might. It can have a lot to do with your water. If you're using water from Los Angeles versus water from Wisconsin, there's going to be different mineral content in there, different nutrients in there, different acidity levels. So you're going to need to kind of figure out what works best with your water and your environment. But overall, there's a general rule of thumb that's called weekly, which basically means you want to use a weak fertilizer about once per week. Generally, I prefer to use a weak fertilizer, and I do it for more of an extended period over the summer, and then I tend to cut fertilizer for the most part in the winter. So you definitely want to provide more nutrients when a plant is actively growing, less in that winter season when they might be dormant or just pretty much shut down as far as active growth. But overall, most fertilizers that you can find, even something like just a standard product you would find at a hardware store, as long as it's a balanced fertilizer where you have sufficient amount of nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, something like a 10-10-10, you can dilute that by half, so it becomes basically a 5-5-5, and that should be sufficient for orchids. What you don't want to do is fertilize heavily. A full concentrated heavy fertilizer can be really detrimental to orchids because, as I mentioned, most of the orchids you're growing at home are going to be tropical epiphytes, and so they're getting most of their nutrients and water from fog in a cloud forest setting and through leachates that come down from rainfall as it runs through leaves and down the bark of its host tree, and then it captures those nutrients directly. So what that means essentially is they're not getting a lot of nutrients. This is not growing in a thick, heavy, humus, nutrient-rich soil. So orchids are used to having minimal nutrient content, and that's really what you want to mimic. So if you have a standard, again, a lot of things are like 20-20-20, you can dilute that to about 1/4 of the recommended strength and spray with that, and that usually should do just fine. Now, there are a lot of specialty orchid fertilizers out there. Look up online. They've done some research, for example, at Michigan State University, specifically on fertilizers for orchids, and they have some really good recommendations there. And people have actually manufactured fertilizers based on those specific recommendations from those studies. So that's worth looking into. But again, weekly, or just a dilute fertilizer. Again, sometimes I will do it in my home collection. I'll use fertilizer for a week, and then I'll cut fertilizer for a week, and then continue for a week, and just so that they're not lacking any nutrients.
Yeah, I like the weekly tip. That's easy to remember, and that's great. We have some questions about blooming and flowering. So sometimes my orchid develops what looks like it's going to be a bloom, but then it turns dark red, gets soft, and eventually shrivels up. What's going on?
Yeah, there can be a number of things that can do that. So that's sounds like what they call bud blasting, which basically means your plant starts to bloom, it initiates the bloom, and then it dies off before it opens. A number of common culprits for that are overwatering when it's about to flower. So when something's about to bloom, you really don't want to saturate it heavily. You don't want to starve it with water or from water, but you don't want to soak it because they can just rot the roots out, or I'm sorry, rot the buds off. They'll just drop off. Another thing can be temperature issues. So plants can start to bloom, and if they get a cold blast on them, that can cause them to abort the flowers. And also a lack of nutrients sometimes can also cause that, where it hasn't been fed properly or it hasn't been fed while it's actively producing that bloom. And so it just kind of says, I don't have what it takes right now to take this all the way through, and it'll just drop the buds off and save the energy for later growth. Yeah, consider changing some of those cultural practices. You might.
That's good to know. We have another flowering question here. I have a moth orchid that successfully reblooms every year. I have also had success with getting it to rebloom on the same stalk that had blooms previously. However, in one instance, it started a new shoot, but then it just stopped. The new shoot is about 18 months old with just a tiny amount of growth. Ever the optimist, I have waited patiently. Is there any chance it will ever grow and bloom?
So I'm sorry, I missed a little bit. This is a moth orchid, you said?
Yes, it's a moth orchid.
Yeah, so those are phalaenopsis, like this guy here, I assume, is what we're speaking of. And yeah, these guys, they can actually produce an inflorescence, have a number of flowers bloom. Those flowers can drop off, and depending on your conditions and the health of your plant and what it's doing, it can actually rebloom and branch from that inflorescence. Now, eventually, the whole inflorescence can kind of start to turn brown and it'll die back. And at that point, you can clip it off. It won't produce any new blooms on that. So one thing to do is when you have your plant flowering and the buds or the flowers fall off, keep an eye on that stalk that's left over. And if it stays a relatively similar color and uniform, think of like a chopstick. It will turn, if it turns that color and turns brown like a little bamboo chopstick, it's generally dried out at that point and it's done. So you can clip it off at the base and work towards getting new inflorescences to push out at a later date. I also heard in that question something about there's a new like a new plantlet coming off some of those.
Yeah, so there was here. I'll reread the second half of it for you there. So they've had success with getting it to rebloom on the same stalk, but they have a new shoot that's just stopped growing. So it started growing. They've been waiting patiently for it to grow, but it's been about 18 months and it's just this tiny little amount of growth, this new stalk that's coming out. And they're just wondering if there's any chance it will ever grow and bloom off that new growth stalk.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm not sure I entirely get the picture on that one, but if it's a new inflorescence, it could just be slow growing. 18 months seems like a long time to me. Again, check your conditions, make sure it has enough water. It may have started to put out an inflorescence and got desiccated or something and killed the active growth tip. That's one option. The other thing is it's possible, if by stalk you mean, or by new growth, if it's putting out what looks like a miniature plant, that can actually happen. Those are called keikis, and those are a lot of times produced when conditions are, how should I say, kind of overprotected. So as I mentioned, a lot of orchids like that dry winter rest where they need a little bit less attention. They don't need as much water. They don't need as much fertilizer. They're not getting as much light. If you're overwatering and over fertilizing during that period of time, it can actually cause the plant, instead of producing flowers, to produce these little offshoots asexually, basically, that can break off and produce new plants. So if that's the case, then you may want to consider your cultivation habits a little bit, and that can maybe induce future blooms as opposed to producing these new vegetative offspring. But that happens a lot in dendrobiums. You can get it in phalaenopsis and things like that as well. The positive side of that is if it is a small little plantlet, you can clip that off and give it to a friend and start them down the road to orchid addiction. So
That's a great suggestion. We've had a couple questions about water, so I just wanted to kind of lump them all together a little bit. But just can you think a little about what is good water, quote unquote? Should it be lukewarm? And is chlorinated water bad for orchids? So just what type of water should we be using and what sort of temperature should it be? Obviously not ice
Yeah.
cream. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of things that go into the water. Generally, the overall best most people consider is pure rainwater. It just hasn't been messed with by us. Some of the worst is tap water. Um, as I mentioned, you can run your plants under the sink, but you have to be cautious with that because for us to drink it, a lot of our water is chlorinated. Most of our water is chlorinated. It has a lot of other minerals in it that an orchid certainly would not want. So if you can use purified water, that's the best. Collect rainwater if you can have some kind of bucket system where you can collect rainwater. It's a free source of perfect water for orchids. Another thing you can do is use filtered water or bottled water. But keep in mind that there are also important micronutrients and other minerals in water that might come out of our tap or other sources like that, that if you're filtering it and purifying it completely, you're removing all of that stuff. So while you're getting rid of the chlorine, which can be harmful to your plant, you're also stripping it of the nutrients that it needs. So you have to be certain to get a a fertilizer that will replenish those types of minerals and nutrients for your orchid as well. Now, one of the things I do at home, here at the garden, we use RO water, which is reverse osmosis. Everything's taken out of it. It's also pH balanced. Again, you want to match your pH of your water to the fertilizer that you might be using. But generally, you don't really want acidic or very basic water. Balanced pH is really important. But one of the things I'll do at home, and a lot of people I would recommend for if you're just growing orchids on your windowsill, is to fill up your water bucket, whether it's a pitcher or a sprayer or something like this. I find it fascinating when you use a clear spray bottle like this. Fill up your water bottle at your sink, leave the top open on the top and just let it hang out and let it sit out for 24 hours to 48 hours. And what you'll see is all these little bubbles forming on the outside of your container. What that is the chlorine that's turning into a gas and it's evaporating out of your water. So it's one of the most simple ways to get rid of one of those harmful chemicals. So if you leave your water sit out for about 24 to 48 hours, most of the chlorine in it will evaporate, at least a large quantity of it, a large proportion of it. And so that'll reduce the amount of chlorine that you're putting on your plant there. So if you don't want to go out and buy filtered or bottled water, if you don't want to collect rainwater, if you don't want to pour a Brita pitcher into this little thing every day, just fill up your watering buckets and let them sit for a few days, and then you can water freely, and that should be okay. But again, the mineral content is important, and you can look in most cities, look at your water district and see what the reports are and what it tells you about the pH and different mineral contents and things of that nature. And if you see something that you know is going to be good for an orchid, again, filter it, leave it sit out, or consider supplementing with some kind of bottled water, provided you give the nutrients it needs back in.
That's super helpful. Thank you. We've had a bunch of questions about light levels. How much sun should an orchid get? And I know that might vary between different types of orchids. And then I have a specific specific type of orchid question related to light levels too, but let's just start in broad strokes.
Yeah, so again, that's an impossible question because they are so diverse and so different. But generally, if you see things like dendrobiums, cattleyas, they can get a little bit brighter. I should start by saying overall, like a south-facing window or a west-facing window, if you're growing in your house, that's generally best. Most orchids do not want direct, extreme sunlight. If you think about where orchids grow, even if they're epiphytes, the majority are growing on tree trunks underneath the tropical rainforest canopy. So there's plenty of light available, but most of that is getting captured by the trees that it's growing on. So orchids like a nice diffuse sunlight. Now, things like cattleyas tend to grow in sunnier locations, so a south-facing window should be pretty good for it. Others, like some of these montane cloud forest orchids, grow in cooler, very cloudy habitats. They can take a little bit less light. Another thing is if you have a really thick succulent orchid where the leaves are very like leathery or almost rigid, they can generally take a little bit more light. Those are usually adaptations for water storage, and so they can tolerate a bit more sunlight and a bit more heat overall. If you're growing orchids that have very thin leaves, generally you can use a little bit less light. Now, I mentioned south-facing window because obviously in your house, that's generally where you're going to get the most sunlight, but they're going to be growing underneath your roof, so they're not getting direct sunlight. If you, I'm sorry, east-facing window, you're going to get good morning light, and that's where you should be putting your orchids. I apologize, because they're going to get that morning light. They're going to warm up through the day. But for example, in summer, as your house is heating up and things are getting warmer and warmer, on your western side, if you get that afternoon sunlight, your house is already going to be really warm and dry from the day's sunshine. And so you kind of want to avoid those west-facing windows, if at all possible, because it'll heat them up even more. But that being said, east, west, south-facing windows, that'll usually provide you the most amount of light, and that in a house will probably be the best for your orchids. A north-facing window, as with most plants, that's pretty shady in your house. They'll probably want a little bit more light than that. A lot of people will also recommend taking orchids outside to get them extra light. But again, it all depends on the time of day and the time of year. So in springtime, when conditions aren't very hot, you can take them outside and get them a good amount of sunlight while things are relatively cool, and then bring them back in when you get this extreme bright, hot conditions of the summer. You just want to make sure you also bring them back in before winter sets in and freeze them as well for the most. But generally, orchids they're a moderate light level plant, but they run the spectrum. So again, these miniature guys, they don't like a lot of light at all. Some of these larger, thick succulent ones, and some species can grow in full light. Again, depends on the plant you're talking. I think for the most part, in your house, you're not going to have too much problems giving it too much sunlight. So make sure you give it enough light. Usually not having enough light is more of a problem than having too much light for the home grower. And of course, when you have a lot of light, increase your water.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think we're going to pop up into a poll really quickly and just sort of get a read on what people are growing in their own homes. So, yep, there you go. So what's your favorite type of orchid to grow at home? There's a whole bunch of different options here. You got Phalaenopsis, Cattleya, and Pests, other types. There's also an option to say, I don't know much about orchids, but I know what I like when I see it. Yeah. Getting some good responses here. Let's let another second or two go by and then we'll share out what people are saying, which is pretty awesome. Let's see. There you go. So it looks like most people are growing Phalaenopsis, and a couple of people don't really know what type they have, but they know what they like when they see it. So that's awesome. Thank you guys so much for sharing. Benny, is that surprising to you that most people have Phalaenopsis in their homes?
No, not at all. That's really what you see mostly in places like your grocery store or your local hardware store, nursery, things of that nature. It's certainly nice to see some Cattleyas on there. Those are kind of less maintenance necessarily for those types of orchids, but they're bigger and they're a little bit more challenging for the home grower as far as getting them enough light and providing them enough space. But I also saw Paphiopedilums on there with the Phalaenopsis. And I will say the Phalaenopsis and the Paphiopedilums, generally speaking, those are two groups that do better, at least here at the U.S. Botanic Garden, and most likely at the home as well, in lower light conditions. So they're a little more user-friendly, if you will, in that you're not going to need huge amounts of light. Keeping them moist, though, is a little bit more important in that case. Cattleyas like to dry out a little bit, but things like Phalaenopsis and Paphiopedilums and Phragmipediums, the slipper orchids, those you want to keep a little bit more moist, a little bit more humid. But again, they don't like really, really bright sunlight. So if you have them in a windowsill in your house, they should do quite well.
Do you have all those different types of orchids in your house, or what's your go-to in your house? You just have them all, yeah.
Gosh, most of the stuff I grow in my house are rescues, so I don't really have too much of a choice in what I get. But yes, I do Phalaenopsis. I do have Cattleyas. I have Cotylogenes. I also have some miniature pleurophalids that are really challenging to keep warm, as well as some terrestrials. I grow some terrestrial species as well. So those are in soil. But yeah, I have a really big variety, I should say. So yeah,
That's
whatever I can get my hands on. Unfortunately, I'm pretty much out of room, so not too many new additions.
that happens. So good. Thank you for sharing that with us. We've had some questions about sort of pests and pathogens and things. So first one is, I'm seeing mold-like material growing in the orchid bark, but my orchid plant is growing a new stem. Should I go ahead and repot? I don't want to disturb the bloom.
That's a great question. So if you're seeing mold in the pot, yeah, it's probably time to repot. Mold can, you can get mold on anything. It can grow on the outside of the pot. You'll see some green algae or lichen type stuff on the outside. That's not necessarily a problem. But if you're getting mold inside the pot, it could certainly be a fungal pathogen of some sort that you definitely don't want. That can kill your orchid. But again, it might just be something harmless that's growing on the bark or in your media. Best thing would be to repot it. Now, that being said, you generally don't want to repot an orchid just before while it's in bloom. It can kind of, be a little bit traumatic to your orchid. They can pout a little bit, and it can cause your flowers to drop off. So if you want to keep that flower, you might not want to repot immediately. But that being said, unless you think it's really a mold that's going to do some harm to your plant, wait till your flower drops off, and then I would repot it then. But yeah, usually that's an indication that your media is breaking down, and that's going to be problematic because, again, it's going to keep your roots too wet. It's not going to allow them to be aerated. If it is a pathogen, you want to get rid of it. And that's also a good time to treat. If you suspect a fungal problem, you might want to treat with a fungicide once you take the plant out of its pot and get it ready for its new plot. You can spray it down with a fungicide. And then it should be nice and healthy and happy in its new house, and it should respond accordingly. So yeah, but as a general rule, repot when you see something like that. Don't repot when your plant's in bloom. But it's a simple question: do you want to kill your entire plant, or do you want to lose one flower? So if you really think it's a problem, sacrifice the flower, cut the inflorescence off, and get your plant healthy again. You'll have a lifetime of blooms versus this one and then a dead plant. So you want to watch out for
that. That's a good suggestion.
And it's spring. We're hitting spring, and spring's a great time to repot. A lot of orchids are just now starting their new growth cycle. You're starting to see roots push out. That's a perfect time to get them in their new pot because you want those new, happy, healthy roots to grow into that new medium and get really settled in for the summer. So yeah, now's a great time to start thinking about stuff.
Awesome. This person says, I have small white bugs on my orchids. They are very small, but have what look like a small tail. How can I get rid of them?
Small white bugs with a small tail. It's an interesting description. It may be mealy bugs. If they look kind of like, gosh, how would I describe them? Well, they look almost like a little grain of rice, but yeah, they can have a little thread-like tail on them. Those are mealy bugs, and those are bad. They will certainly kill your orchid if you let them take off. How you can kill them? I'm a big proponent, first of all, of manual assault, if you will, on pests. So one of the first things I do, and that's just because I'm not a huge fan of pesticides, and that it's another chemical you're adding to your plant, you're adding to your house if you have pets or kids or things of that nature. Plus, they're really not that good for the environment. So the less pesticide you can use, the better off we all are. So the first thing I'll do is a manual treatment. You can use your spray bottle in a lot of cases on that kind of like a squirt gun type spray. You can actually physically blast a lot of those guys off. I'll squish them with my hands manually, but you want to keep things clean. You don't want to touch one plant, kill a bug, touch another plant. You can actually spread eggs and increase your pest problem. But of course, eventually, pesticide's the way to go. So if you see something that's really getting out of control, find yourself a nice pesticide that's not too strong. You want to test it first. Make sure that it specifically says it's usable on things like orchids. And then you want to treat that by really covering the plant. And what I mean by that is you're going to want to get the upper surface of the leaves, but also the lower surface. A lot of insects are smarter than we think. Your plant looks nice and clean. It starts yellowing out. You turn the leaf over, and it's covered with bugs underneath where you can't see them necessarily. really readily. So make sure you get a good coverage with a pesticide. You can start with, again, things that are a little more moderate, like a neem oil or a hort oil, which essentially just suffocates the insects. It's not as toxic, but eventually you may have to break out the big guns and use a chemical fertilizer. And again, it's better to do it fully than halfway, if you will. So make sure you get in the leaf cracks, underneath the leaves, really good coverage, because a single insect or two can just produce another 1,000 eggs tomorrow. So if you miss one or two that's tucked in those little cracks where they hide, your plant will look healthy, happy, and 3 weeks from now you'll have bugs again, because the ones that survive will just start reproducing. So be diligent about it. Spray, keep an eye on it, consider spraying again a week or 2 weeks later, and do that until you really don't see any rebound. But again, I like to do mechanical stuff. I'll kill insects by hand. If you have big outbreaks on certain leaves, I'll cut those leaves off. If you have something like a dendrobium that has multiple stems, part of the plant is covered, I'll cut those parts off. I'll treat the rest of the plant, and usually that does pretty well. And if you're really adverse to pesticides, there's a number of home remedies. You can mix things like water with a little detergent, a little rubbing alcohol. Some mixes even call for a few drops of olive oil. And those things do basically the same thing. Alcohol will kill a lot of the insects. The oil can suffocate them, things of that nature. And and the detergent can also help kill them. They're not as strong, of course, as commercial pesticides. But if you don't have a big problem, it can knock them back far enough where you can really get a hold on the problem. And then things like, manual killing can keep your plant at least healthy enough where it's not going to have major problems. But eventually, once those outbursts or those outbreaks really take hold, you'll have to switch to commercial pesticides.
Thanks, Benny. Libby had to jump out, so you might have seen me floating around the chat, folks, but we do have a couple more questions. So one question we have is, how long does an orchid plant typically live?
That is a great question. Again, it's species specific. For example, a lot of the research I did was on Lepanthes, which are pleurothalids. They're really miniature. The flowers are about half a centimeter in size, quarter of a centimeter. But studies on those plants show that in the wild, they can live upwards of 7 years, which is pretty long, but it's not that long. Other plants that I've seen in collections have been around since the 70s. So if they're maintained properly, they can live 25, 30 years. It just depends on how well you're taking care of them. Now, that being said, nothing lives forever. So if you've had a plant for 10, 15 years and suddenly it dies, it may not be your fault. So everything comes to an end at some point. But yeah, in collections, they can live for quite a while, certainly.
Thanks, Benny. And related to that, if an orchid owner were a good owner and the plant was a good plant, how many times a year should it bloom?
Again, species specific in many cases. Some orchids can bloom regularly throughout the year. You can get things that will bloom, 4, 5, 6 times. They'll just keep pushing flowers out as long as they have the energy to do so. Other plants, there's certain species like Sobralia. They'll bloom generally once, maybe twice a year, and the flowers only last a single day. So they'll come out and they're gone by the end of the day, which can be very frustrating for those of you that may have a 9-to-5 job, and you'll see your orchid ready to open in the morning and it's wilted and fell off by the time you got home. But again, it's species specific. I guess overall, if you had to generalize, usually, 2 times a year, a lot of times you get spring blooms and fall blooms. In the spring, they're getting more sunlight, things are warming up, they get happy and they bloom. Fall bloomers, they've had a nice summer to grow vegetatively, soak up a lot of nutrients, and then as the seasons start to shorten in terms of day length, they'll kick out blooms in the fall and then go into that winter dormant season. So if you're getting a plant to bloom twice a year, you're doing great. So yeah.
Thanks, Benny. And I think we'll take one more question. I've got one last question for you, and that's, what's your favorite orchid or a group of orchids that we have in our collection at the U.S. Botanic Garden?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, we do have Lepanthes, which is the genus that I did my dissertation research and I continue to research. I really like them, particularly because they're one of the most diverse genera out there. There's now estimates are close to 1,500 species, and they're really, really, really tiny, which I find fascinating. But if you look closely, they're really, really beautiful flowers. They're very ornate. It's just very small in detail. The other group that I would have to say that I'm really fascinated with is actually the most diverse genus, strangely enough, and that's the bulbophyllums. And these I really am fascinated by because they're all generally characterized by this hinged lip that can move and attract insects and kind of shake in the wind. But they're extremely diverse. And so some have these really long, ornate, beautiful flowers that are really sweet and fragrant. Others smell kind of like the corpse flower. They attract beetles and flies. And so they have this really rancid, kind of rotting meat smell to them, which are really fascinating. But again, some of these bulbophyllums can be 2 millimeters in size with a leaf that's almost the size of a hair, not much to it at all, really tiny flowers, whereas others can have leaves that are 2 feet in length, really big pseudobulbs the size of a baseball. But again, these really ornate, odd looking flowers. So those have always been some of my favorites. And I think most importantly, in those groups, not only are they highly diverse, but a lot of them are very, very rare. They're endemic to very specific locations, some being found only at 1 or 2 sites on the planet. So from a conservation perspective, which is really what my background is in, they're really important to me because they're often overlooked due to their size. But as far as orchid diversity and maintaining a diverse community, they're really special.
Well, thank you so much, Benny, and thank you for sharing your expertise today. You might get some emails from the plant hotline because there were so many questions. I know we got to a fraction of them. So thank you so much for taking the time to share your knowledge with us today, Benny.
My pleasure. Thank you guys for joining us.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. That'll conclude our program for the day. And we hope to see you soon at another one of our programs. So thank you so much for joining.